Welcome to Plato's Pod. Today is May 16, 2021. This is a live meetup through Toronto Philosophy Meetup, Calgary Philosophy Meetup, and Online Rebels. I'm Eva, coordinating today's meeting. I'm excited to invite James now for today's discussion. What are we discussing about today, James?
Well, thank you, Evan. Great to be here on this wonderful, sunny, summery morning here in Toronto, and welcoming those who have been with us before, but also a number of new people, which is great to see. So we're here this morning to discuss Plato's dialogue, the Euthyphro, which is a relatively short dialogue, but I think it follows quite well on our last discussion a few weeks ago on the Critias. And so in the Euthyphro, Plato is looking at our connection with God or the gods, and in particular in the context of piety and what it means to be pious. And there's a number of logical things that he does in this dialogue, which I think are quite interesting. And so we'll look forward to discussing those. And just wanted to remind people, as we talked about last time, after we finished the recording at noon, would stay online for those who want to join us for Plato's Cafe. And the idea is that we could just, have an informal, unrecorded discussion, whether it's on the topics that we've discussed in today's session or on any of Plato's other dialogues, or even just philosophy in general. I think it would be interesting to just have that discussion. So anybody who wants to stay online after we finish the recording and then just join us in a casual discussion for a half an hour, that would be great. And then I think we'll think about kind of winding down the podcast for the summer months, just because people get busy and people want to be out doing their own things. But hopefully we'll get another session or two in. I think next I would like to look at the first part of the Theaetetus. The Theaetetus is a very long dialogue, but the first part is the part that deals with the world before motion is brought into the picture, which is in the second part of the Theaetetus. So I think we'll look at the Theaetetus next. So those who want to start reading that, as I said, it's long, but we'll look at the first roughly half of it and see how far we can get. I've got a couple of readings that Eva will share on the screen today, and hopefully we could have a volunteer or two to help read. They're relatively short passages and there's not a lot of words, but it would be great if we could have a volunteer or two read either the part of Socrates or the part of Euthyphro. And just a reminder, if people could use the raise hands function in Zoom when they'd like to speak, that would be great. I'll take people in the order in which they put their hands up and give preference to those who haven't spoken before. And we'll see what points we can make. There's also the chat function on screen, which I'm not able to follow too closely as I'm focusing on the episode itself, but we do record the chat function, and it's something that I always enjoy looking at after the episode is over. Also, a reminder that we are posting these as podcasts on rss.com/podcast/PlatosPod. And it's been a great pleasure actually to re-listen to some of the episodes that we've recorded before. As I was doing this morning, actually just kind of reminded of a number of very interesting points that were brought up in our own dialogue that individually it's hard to think of everything, and so there were some very interesting points that were brought up in our previous dialogues. And I think that's really a key purpose of the dialogue method that Plato employs, is that we learn something from each other in the course of this discussion. Each of us has our own individual perspectives, and then when we start to bring the perspectives together, it's interesting what new knowledge is derived, what things that we haven't thought of before, how those manage to touch us, and the meaning that it creates when we engage in this dialogue. So definitely encourage everybody to participate, either by sharing in the readings today or just with your thoughts and questions. And then by all means, please do feel free to listen to the recorded podcasts if you'd like afterwards. So welcome again to those returning and who have been with us here before, and a special welcome to a number of new folks who have joined us today. So welcome all to Plato's Pod, and look forward to diving into the discussion on the Euthyphro, which is again about our relationship with God or the gods. Maybe I'll just start the discussion by explaining this screen image that I have on my screen behind me. And this is a painting of Galileo being subjected to the Inquisition. This was in the early 1600s. I'm sorry, I've forgotten the year. But he was accused of being impious, going against what God said in terms of his views that were expressed that the earth revolved around the sun and not the other way around. So it was widely accepted view for a long time that everything revolved around the earth. And when Galileo, the great scientist, started using telescopes and he saw interesting things like the fact that he could see 4 moons of Jupiter, and he could see that these moons of Jupiter were orbiting Jupiter. They weren't orbiting Earth. And that seemed to contradict this idea that was held for millennia that the Earth was the center of everything and that everything revolved around the Earth. And so that was seen as impious. And the Inquisition subjected Galileo to this questioning. And then they forbid him from publishing his views. And this was not too long after Giordano Bruno, the very innovative scientist who has some really interesting new ideas, was burned alive at the stake in 1600 for being impious. And so in the Euthyphro, Plato talks about piety, but we have, I think, a problem with the definition of piety, don't we? Is piety always the same definition now as it was yesterday, or as it was 100 years ago, or as it was 500 years ago in Galileo's time? How do we approach the definition of piety and our perception, the meaning of it? And is it always something the same? And I just wanted to maybe just start the discussion off with that, and this idea that the whole dramatic setup in this dialogue, which is where Socrates meets Euthyphro, who is about to prosecute his father for murder and for being impious. And I'm just wondering what people think about piety and how we define piety and what it means to be pious. Were there any particular things in the dialogue that struck you about this idea and this meaning, and how we apply that meaning, whether it's in the context of Galileo and the Inquisition in the screen image behind me, because that was a long time in the past and maybe we know a lot more now? Or are there any other contexts, historical contexts, that we can think of that really affect our understanding of the meaning of piety? I wonder if anybody has any thoughts on that. There's an interesting thing that the dialogue starts with, and I just maybe, Eva, if you could just share the screen, the first page on the screen of the reading, and while we're doing that, we'll take Moshe. Moshe, you have a thought?
I had a thought in 1981, and it was so uncomfortable, I've never thought again. But to talk about piety, I think it's you can get some clarity about piety by what impiety is. And you're right. I mean, the meanings have changed. And the old classical Greek or Platonic idea of impiety was was the idea that man could have the same knowledge as God, and because man is so different from God, that the possibility that man could have the same knowledge as God was impious, and we also know, well, at least platonically from the Phaedrus, and I've come back to this several times, that the gods are only the gods by their closeness, their proximity to the forms. And so as we gain greater knowledge of the forms, we become like the god, not the anthropomorphic God of the Judeo-Christian tradition, but the God of what Plato meant by God. At the time of Galileo, this idea of God and knowledge of what God had been co-opted by the church, and now the church had an official stand on a number of scientific things, and clearly they were out of their logical bounds by doing that. I mean, people who are experts on religion should be consulted for their expertise on religion, but not their expertise on physics or chemistry or biology or anything like that. It's not their thing. And the other way around, to go and talk to go and talk to a medical doctor about God. Well, they're medical doctors. They didn't study that. So at the time of Galileo, piety was doing what the church said, and impiety was doing something against the church. Today in the 20th century or 21st century, I don't know if we have a clear idea of what piety is at all. The whole idea of some sort of reverence or holiness has been sort of whitewashed out of our cultural thinking, except for some small or smaller pockets. So those are my remarks. I think we gain a little knowledge of what piety is by understanding impiety, and it certainly has changed from the time of the Greeks to Galileo to now.
Well, thank you. And you used a key word there is understanding. And we talked last episode, actually, when we talked about the Critias, about the nature of understanding and this idea that understanding maybe requires some sort of a harmony. I think that was maybe Greg who talked about harmony and understanding last episode. And last episode, indeed, we talked about, there was a great quote here, if I can just find it now on my screen, from the Critias, in terms of, it was a bit of a warning, actually. It's at 107b in Critias, in which it said, he is a successful speaker when he speaks of gods to an audience of mortals. The audience's lack of experience and sheer ignorance concerning a subject they can never know for certain provide the would-be speaker with great eloquence. And so, as you said, Moshe, there's been some change over time in the understanding of the meaning of piety from the time of the Greeks to the time of Galileo to now. And actually, I was very interested when I looked up in the Oxford English Dictionary, my edition from the mid-70s. There's actually a definition of piety that is a negative definition. One of the definitions is actually in the negative sense that calling somebody pious is a bit of an ironic or accusatory expression, a way of saying that maybe they are being overly judgmental. So there's this usage has developed over time as well, this negative usage. JK, what do you think? Welcome.
Hello there. Yeah, good morning. It seems that during that time that they were, when they were having this discussion about piety, there's the gods, right, who are supposed to be models of piety, but they were a little bit at times, they're more powerful beings than humans, and for that reason they were supposed to be a model of what what is best. But they were also kind of unruly too, right? They sometimes behave, in their own way, and so maybe that was kind of misleading people like Euthyphro into a kind of misunderstanding what pious means. I don't know, because I think it's a kind of a cultural thing, like in other cultures you have more of you have this familiar piety, right? You have a piety based on family relations, that you're supposed to respect your elders, right, in the family, and that extends out into the rest of society. And piety, is understood in this way. But at that time, the gods are kind of transcendent, and like the forms, right? And so maybe it's a little bit more difficult to understand, and it becomes ambiguous what piety is. So I think that's what the discussion is about. What is piety? And I was a little confused too by even at the end what the kind of arguments that Socrates is offering about what piety is, and relating it to geometry and mathematics. It's so I had to, so to me, I'm not clear what he meant by Socrates meant by piety either.
Thank you. And I think, as always, Socrates leaves us somewhat bewildered and wanting to question more without giving us a definite answer. But I think that's something that I think can continue to be discussed for a long time. And I guess that's part of the benefit of discussion that I was talking about at the outset. And you touched on the idea that the gods don't necessarily agree among themselves all the time, and that's discussed directly in this dialogue. There's the passage at 8b. In which Socrates says, "So it is in no way surprising if your present action, namely punishing your father, may be pleasing to Zeus, but displeasing to Cronus and Uranus, pleasing to Hephaestus, but displeasing to Hera, and so with any other gods who differ from each other on this subject." And so at the time of ancient Greece, I mean, we had this idea of these multiple gods, this sort of hierarchy of gods, and the idea that the gods could disagree among themselves. And so how are we to find a single form or a general form of piety if the gods themselves are in disagreement? And so this occupies some of the the train of discussion in the dialogue. So thank you for bringing that up, that idea of the disagreement among the gods. Jane, welcome. What are your thoughts?
Good morning, everybody. My thoughts are, well, at least not my thoughts, but based on the dialogue, it seemed that piety and impiety is directly connected to and is, like Socrates said, a part of the justice. So we have justice and injustice, as well as he links it to the terms of evil and good. Regarding the disagreement among the gods, it's actually kind of interesting because in this dialogue, Socrates indirectly implies that the gods may not themselves understand what is just and what is unjust, and what is evil and what is good, and therefore this always causes conflict among the gods as well. I guess this is one of the dialogues that illustrates what Socrates got into trouble for in the first place too. And it's interesting that I think this sort of dichotomy of justice, injustice, evil, and good is present throughout all the ages. And I guess the reason why impiety and piety are not popular terms in our modern society is because the words justice, injustice, evil, and good, we have a lot of people who feel very differently about each of those terms. So if you ask one person what is justice and what is injustice, you may get very different answers. There's a sort of, I guess, a polarization. And it feels like in modern society, those terms can have a very subjective meaning nowadays, and objectivity seems to be getting farther and farther away from us. But that's my personal view. So yes, that's all I wanted to share. Thank you.
Thank you. And you use the word subjective and objective, and I think that's actually very key to what Plato is trying to do in that little argument, that little train of logic that leads up to 11a. And that's something that I definitely want to touch on, is paragraph 11a and the train of logic that led to that, and this constant shift between subject and object. So the subject is that which is affected by something, and the object receives the action of something. And when they talk about, when Socrates and Euthyphro talk about whether pious is being loved by the gods, or whether being loved by the gods makes you pious, that's a bit of the account of the reasons why we might consider somebody pious. And it was last episode, actually, when we talked about the Critias, that Eric, who was here at the time, reminded us of Plato's dialogue, the Meno, in which Plato, through Socrates, said that all knowledge is recollection. And then right at the end of the Meno, Socrates then further adds, and recollection is the account of the reasons why. And so what are the reasons why somebody might be considered pious? And I think that's a very important part about understanding the sequence of logic that makes us think that something is pious or not pious. Again, in the screen image, the idea that thinking that the Earth was not the center of all revolution in the universe was somehow thought to be impious. And how does that reasoning come to be? And then how does that reasoning change? So here we are, some 500 years after Galileo, and our reasons have changed. We would not consider somebody who holds that view to be impious, because we know now that the widely held view that the Earth was the center of everything was wrong. And yet somehow it was considered impious at that time. Greg, welcome. What are your thoughts?
Yeah. As I was reading this thing, and then in reflection of what the people just said about the piety, and I think at the end of the day, it really is piety is a reflection of the morality of the society at the time, and throughout the history and through the culture, they change depending on the time and depends on the society. So at the Greek time, everything was modeled around gods. Gods were considered as a reality, not just imagined. Therefore, the Greek live around their life around the gods, what the gods think, what the gods say, and they invent it, and they don't separate what's invented and what's real. And so I'm looking at the thing, and what strikes me is that this dialogue is considered to be one of the early dialogue of Plato. And I look at that, see that it seems that Plato has thought long and hard, and in this early time, he pointed out that there's a contradiction of using God as a standard. So in order to launch his philosophical discussion about the rationality, where he really laid a lot of foundations, that he had to take down the absolute authority of the gods, the system of gods, because that's their standards for everything, including how to reason, how to knowledge, and so on. So I think this may be the beginning of using Socrates, this dialogue to really challenge the view of God being a standard. And by doing so, he brought out a few contradictions there, in terms of the cause effect. What is the cause? What is the effect? Really, which come first? And these are the things that at the time it was not clear. And as bring out, and also the idea of a definition, which later on becomes so important as a form. Here he brings out that you can't really define these things. It's not clear. And so these things is already see the set a stage for his later dialogues. I find it's fascinating and very interesting.
Thank you, and I really like the way that you you use those words, the idea of the contradiction of using God as a standard, and this confusion between cause and effect, which really starts at 9D and goes to 11A. And what is the cause of piety and what is the effect of piety? And again, getting back to that subject and object idea that Jane started, I think, talking about, and really understanding what is the cause and what is the effect, and can you use God as a standard? I would just remind, again, as I tend to always do in these episodes after reading the Timaeus, 28a in Timaeus, which makes that distinction between the realm of being, which always is and never becomes, and the realm of becoming, which never is, but is always becoming. Plato elsewhere described the present as a state of coming to be. And so, here we're actors in the present, and we're trying to understand something that's eternally in being, which is maybe the gods. And so maybe that's part of understanding this distinction between who are we and what are the gods. And so if we could maybe agree, I don't know if we agree, but maybe we can agree that the gods are eternal and we are not eternal. We're trying to understand something eternal. Well, in Timaeus 28a, they make the point that to understand the realm that always is and never becomes, this eternal realm of being, which perhaps is the realm that the gods inhabit, you need to use a reasoned account. It actually says reasoned account. And then we get into what Eric reminded us last episode, which is this idea of knowledge as recollection and the account of the reasons why. So, Greg, you just reminded us, this in forming the account of the reasons why, we need to know what the cause is, and we need to know what the effect is. And we need to know who we are compared to who the gods are. So a very powerful point that you just made, and thank you for that. And then we'll go on to JK. Welcome, JK. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I was just thinking about this idea of the cause and effect, and you talked about the leader and the led and so forth, and maybe this idea of that we love, what we believe loves us, right? And we love to be loved, and so if we have an idea that we can latch on to, that gives us a sense of being loved, or then that's what we believe is pious, and what is holy. So maybe that's what he's getting at, that we're we're getting away from what the truth of what is pious by being misled by this idea that we have somehow latched onto. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I mean this idea that piety is some sort of fixed thing that doesn't change over time and isn't subject to our interpretation. Somehow it's, as Greg said, this idea that, if you use God as the standard, then how do you understand what God is? And so I think there's a warning here. And Eva, if you would just display that first page, I just thought I would just read that part from the beginning of the Euthyphro at 2c. And this is where, before they get into the argument that JK just referred to, Socrates is just explaining his own prosecution, or the prosecution that Meletus is bringing against him. And this would, of course, lead to the apology, the famous trial of Socrates, and then to the Phaedo, to the death of Socrates. So here Socrates is foreshadowing his own demise as a physical being, but not necessarily as a soul of ideas that has affected us throughout time ever since. And so this is in 2c of the Euthyphro, and Socrates is saying, what charge? So he's talking about the charge that Meletus brought against him. He says, what charge? A not ignoble one, I think. For it is no small thing for a young man, Meletus was young, to have knowledge of such an important subject being piety, and having claimed that Socrates, or having accused Socrates of being impious. He says he knows how our young men are corrupted and who corrupts them. He is likely to be wise, and when he sees my ignorance corrupting his contemporaries, he proceeds to accuse me to the city as to their mother. I think he is the only one of our public men to start out the right way, for it is right to care first that the young should be as good as possible, just as a good farmer is likely to take care of the young plants first, and of the others later. So too, Meletus first gets rid of us who corrupt the young shoots, as he says, and then afterwards he will obviously take care of the older ones and become a source of great blessing for the city, as seems likely to happen to one who started out this way. And I love this passage. I mean, it's right at the start of the dialogue, but you can see the irony that Socrates is putting here for one who starts out this way. And one who starts out this way, I think he's referring to assumptions that Meletus is making about what piety is and what piety is not. And it was on these assumptions that Meletus accused Socrates of impiety. And it was for those reasons eventually that Socrates would be put to death. And so this is, I think, a bit of a warning. And then we saw the warnings again in the Critias, which we discussed last time. This idea that anybody can make grand speeches about, what the gods are and what piety is. to an audience of people who can't possibly know for certain what it is, because to understand what it is, we need to make an account of the reasons why. So I thought this was a very interesting beginning to this dialogue, and something that really reflected a warning about making assumptions about that which we cannot know for sure. And so it really goes to the nature of knowledge, doesn't it? What it is, what is it to know something? What is it to know what piety is, if you don't know what piety is not? So maybe you need to know all of it, and to know all of that, that's maybe where we need the account of the reasons why. So maybe having touched on the idea of that that logical sequence, Eva, I'm just wondering if you could go to the third page, which is reading number 2. And I'm just wondering if there would be a volunteer or two. I could read one of the parts if we don't have 2 volunteers, but it'd be great if we could get 1 volunteer at least to read just this short passage. And if we could have 1 person playing the role of Socrates and 1 playing the role of Euthyphro. And then we can maybe just discuss this last part of this section that leads to this kind of logical sequence that gets them into some sort of disagreement. Euthyphro starts with an assumption and then finds out that his assumption isn't necessarily correct. And this seems to happen all the time when Socrates speaks to people. It certainly happened to Meno in that dialogue. The Meno that I mentioned earlier, the idea that Meno at the beginning thought he knew what virtue was. And Socrates says, okay, well, what's virtue? And Meno starts giving examples of what virtue is. And Socrates says, well, I didn't ask for examples. I asked for the general form of virtue. And so we've been mentioned the word forms here. There's this idea of the general form being the idea itself of virtue, or in this case, in this dialogue, of piety. Is there some general form to which all particular examples of piety are rooted? So could I ask for if there's anybody interested in volunteering for either role of Socrates or Euthyphro?
I got dibs on Socrates.
All right, Joel is Socrates. And why didn't I be Euthyphro? Or Jane? Jane, would you like to take one of the roles?
Yes, I could go ahead.
All right, Joel and Jane. Joel is Socrates and Jane is Euthyphro. Thank you.
However, is this the correction we are making in our discussion, that what all the gods hate is impious and what they all love is pious, and that what some gods love and others hate is neither or both? Is that how you now wish us to define piety and impiety?
What prevents us from doing so, Socrates?
For my part, nothing, Euthyphro, but you look whether on your part this proposal will enable you to teach me mostly easily what you promised.
I would certainly say that the pious is what all the gods love, and the opposite, what all the gods hate, is the impious.
Then let us again examine whether that is a sound statement, or do we let it pass, if one of us or someone else merely says that something is so, do we accept that it is so, or should we examine what the speaker means?
We must examine it, but I certainly think that this is now a fine statement.
We shall soon know better whether it is. Consider this. Is the pious being loved by the gods because it is pious, or is it pious because it is being loved by the gods?
Well, thank you both for that. That's great. And I think it's really good to hear the words out loud and to really understand, to put ourselves in that setting, and to put ourselves in this discussion that Socrates and Euthyphro are having. And so a little bit of the background of this section is that, Socrates has said, well, if you know, Euthyphro, what piety is, then maybe you can be my teacher. And then maybe when I'm standing up in that trial for that Meletus is accusing me of impiety, I could blame you, my teacher, for teaching me to be impious. And so then I'm not at fault. I'm not the cause of the impiety. So he was kind of really neat little background to that section of the dialogue. So, what do people think about that the last few lines there? We shall soon know better whether it is. Consider this. Is the pious being loved by the gods because it is pious, or is it pious because it is being loved by the gods? So what is the cause and what is the effect here? And then how does Socrates build out that argument in terms of cause and effect in really trying to understand the account of the reasons why? Why is it that something is pious and something is not pious? So we start with the idea that pious, that because somebody is pious, it is therefore loved by the gods, or because it is loved by the gods, it is therefore pious. So the question is, where is the because and where is the therefore? And where do the gods fit into the picture? And are the gods eternal? Is it this problem that Greg mentioned of using God as a standard? Joel, what are your thoughts?
Just very quickly. So the very last sentence is it essentially is the Euthyphro dilemma. Just clarifying that's it's just my quick question. That last sentence is that couple thousand-year prolong of that moral question.
A good question. Yeah, I think that's really central to the whole dilemma of understanding what piety is. So how does the argument unfold from that point? Socrates gives a number of examples. He talks about things being carried, and therefore they are carried things. He talks about things being led, and therefore they are things. He talks about things being led, and therefore they are led things. There's a few other examples. Moshe, your thoughts?
Well, I thought the thing about carried and being carried and being led was so opaque. I mean, I couldn't make any sense out of it at all. But I want to go back to the reading. I just want to, from a logical point of view, I want to set up where the argument is going to fall apart. Euthyphro says, "I would certainly say that the pious is what all the gods love, and the opposite, what all the gods hate, is impious." Now, we call that a universal quantifier. That all means every single one of the gods is going to have to be on board with this. Okay, every single one of the gods has to agree about what piety is, and everyone also agrees about what impiety is. And you can, from this point, defeat almost any argument because the equation has been already made between the gods and man, that the gods have differing opinions on things, just as man has different opinions on things, and the places where everybody agrees would be on statements of fact and statements of what we call later a priori knowledge, like knowledge of mathematics. But where they disagree are on things like love and justice and beauty and things like that. So Euthyphro is being set up from the very beginning with this idea that all the gods have to be able to agree.
Thank you, and I like the term that you use, universal qualifier. I think that's how you said it, and it's
quantifier.
Or quantifier, yeah. And I like that. I mean, I think that's very helpful to understand, is that there is this appeal to what is assumed to be a universal, but is not necessarily known to be a universal. And how do we approach that, especially when there is sometimes disagreement among the universal beings? So the gods are not necessarily always in agreement with themselves. And so, originally Socrates says, well, what happens if you follow one god, but another god disagrees with that god? And so then they start boiling it down and say, well, okay, we have to throw away those areas where the gods disagree. and we have to take only the areas where the gods agree. But how do we know what the gods agree on, right? So there's assumptions being made here, and this idea of the universal quantifiers, which really kind of shut down the argument, maybe, or they're trying to use it to shut down. Euthyphro is trying to use it to shut down the argument. Greg, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that's a very distinct point here. All the gods, he just point out something very fundamental regarding particular and the universal. But my feeling here is that Plato doesn't seem to really want to say, not so much interested really to know exactly what piety is. He is using piety as a point of argument to really establish the form as an independent thing from the gods. And he go around and around about a lead and led, and also he will elaborate later on, is it love, is it care, is it dear, is it service, to see that, okay, if it's not a love, there must be care. If it's not care, it must be dear. If it's not dear, it must be service. Go around as if to take all the possible reason that God may be in control, or maybe the reference for all these things. He really exposed them, but he didn't really address them. In a sense that it's dialogue, it seems to me, is more sort of expose all the flaws that are by reference to gods as a standards for everything. That's the one hand, but also expose in a subtle way all the different type of logical reason later on become important and discussed in different separate dialogues, for example, definition and the cause effect, but also category. Like there's a few points that Plato laid out as what is bigger, what is small. This is very fundamental, I think, in terms of try to understand that later on. I think these things will be the foundation for Aristotle, for his logic. Category and definition are very, very important.
Can I jump in here?
Yes, indeed, Eva.
So I am wondering, how much are we messed up with the idea of religion that we were born with? How would this discussion would happen if there was only one religion, or if there was only one belief connection way, and which was not even called religion? So how much of our own personal, I will say, historical junk or trauma are we bringing into this discussion? And how much was it in this text that is happening here? So I was just curious about that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think what you have said, Evan, what Greg said is, they're important points, and I think they tie together. Eva, you talked about personal perspectives, and certainly each of us is a being that we define ourselves. Nobody defines me unless I let them define me. So it's always in my power to define who and what I am. But when Greg mentioned categories and definitions are important, I think that's the idea of maybe tying together who and what you are and your perspectives with everybody else. And that's an important point in terms of trying to find maybe this one form of piety. It was at it's around 6E and 7A, where Socrates says, "Bear in mind that I did not bid you tell me one or two of the many pious actions, but that form itself that makes all pious actions pious. For you agree that all impious actions are impious, and all pious actions pious through one form. Or don't you remember?" It's right there on that page of it. Yeah. So I'm just reading the bit about Socrates there, the third or fourth section from the bottom. Euthyphro says, "I do." And then Socrates says, Tell me then what this form itself is, so that I may look upon it, and using it as a model, say that any action of yours or another's that is of that kind, is pious, and if it is not, that it is not. Euthyphro says, well then, what is dear to the gods is pious, what is not is impious. So Euthyphro kind of takes this bit of a cop-out, where he stops reasoning, and he says, it is what it is. What is dear to the gods is pious, and what is not is impious. So how does he arrive at that conclusion? That's not a reasoned conclusion. That's maybe just one from his own individual perspective, one from maybe his own historical perspective, like you were talking, Eva. Maybe it's lack of ability to put piety and definition into these categories that Greg was talking about. So is there a single form of piety? And as Greg mentioned earlier, can you use God as the standard for that? So then that gets us back into that logical flow in that section that we read together from 9D to 10A. And so what is the cause and what is the effect? So is the ending question in that section when Socrates says, we shall soon know better whether it is. Consider this, is the pious being loved by the gods because it is pious, or is it pious because it is being loved by the gods? So what's the cause and what's the effect? And, cause and effect is the difference between, or cause and effect, we need to consider the difference between subject and object, which I mentioned earlier. The idea that the subject is that which is affected by something. So Socrates then says, well, if you're loved by the gods, are you affected by that love from the gods? And the object receives the action. So are you the object of the gods' love, or are you the subject of the gods' love? And I think that's an especially important distinction to make, because I think Socrates then, says that if we can't separate the subject from the object, it winds up being like the statues of Daedalus. So again, he brings in the statue of Daedalus motif, which he brought in Meno. These statues that were so lifelike that they seem to almost run around on themselves, and they keep going around and around, and nobody was tying them down. So he uses that kind of as a metaphor for knowledge. But this idea of separating the subject from the object, I thought was particularly interesting. So what does he do in this logical sequence? So first he says, is that which is being carried is a carried thing? And they say, yes, it is. That which is being led, is it a led thing? Yes, it is. That which is being seen, it is a thing seen. That which is being loved by a god is a god-loved thing. So in the very first instance, in each of those little logical connections, the subject is the thing that is the action of being. So there's an action of being carried, being led, being seen, being loved by God, right? So that's the subject. And then the object in each of the cases is the thing. So we have the carried thing because it is being carried. We have the thing led because it is being led. We have the thing seen because it is being seen. And we have the God-loved thing because it is being loved by God. So there's that kind of account of the reasons why that separates the subject from the object. And I thought that was really kind of interesting what Socrates did there. Well, really interesting, and particularly so because of the point of technology that we exist in now, and our search for the ability to effect quantum entanglement. And so those who have been with this series since the beginning will know that one of my pastimes is to follow quantum computing and the developments in quantum computing. And I had the real pleasure yesterday to attend just a wonderfully explained session on quantum computing. It was just so well explained, the whole connection in the developing science of quantum computing. But we have this fundamental problem with quantum computing called the observer effect, which is, as soon as you in physics, as soon as you observe a quantum effect, it changes. So the act of observation actually causes a change. And actually, when we had our dialogue on the Charmides about a month or two ago, I think it was Joel at the time who said that as soon as he thinks about himself, his definition of self changes. Like the very act of thinking about yourself changes yourself. And so, we have this question about what is the subject and the object. And I think it is of particular relevance, to us in this particular technological point of development that we're at. And what do we use as a standard? To go back to the question that Greg asked about, in this case of Euthyphro, using God as a standard to judge, or do we use something else as a standard? How do we fit our own perspectives into it? The question that Eva asked, our own perspectives in life. And so what do you think about that sequence of logic that leads to the conclusion at where was it? It was the conclusion at 11a, where Socrates says, "But if the God loved and the pious were the same, my dear Euthyphro, then if the pious was being loved because it is pious, the God loved would also be being loved because it was God loved. And if the God loved was God loved because it was being loved by the gods, then the pious would also be pious because it was being loved by the gods." So he set up a bit of a feedback loop there, maybe. So we have Kevin with your hand up. Kevin, welcome to Plato's Pod, and what are your thoughts?
Thank you, James. I listen carefully, loved it. I'm not sure my comment maybe offense or just let me, because you mentioned quantum computing, observe that's cause and effect. Also, recently, another forum we learned Dao De Jing. It's if you heard it, Dao is the way can be told. It's not the Dao. The name can be said, can be spoken. It's not the name. So that's kind of, similar kind of cause effect. Objective or subjective, obviously similar. That's one observation for me. We think the Eastern philosophy or logic is different than Western. From that, it put like a traditional, good or bad. Actually, for me, fundamentally, pursue the theme, the method could be if you use abstract or it's fundamentally similar to. I don't want to waste your time and explain more because off topic.
Thank you, and appreciate your perspective on that, and particularly, this idea that, Eastern philosophy and Western philosophy, that there are differences, but maybe there's also similarities, and, maybe it's a question of finding similarities that will lead us to some new knowledge and to some particular recollection of a general form of something. I think it's, to go back to what Eva said about each having different perspectives and different histories. It actually reminds me of something that when I was listening to episode number 5 on the Phaedrus, something that Jane said is that, that we can only know fragments of reality because we're only, each of us has a limited lifespan. We can't know everything in our limited lifespan, but we can see, fragments of reality. And maybe it's this idea of getting together that will lead us to put these fragments together to then start to see this grand picture. JK, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I was, thinking about these, cause and effect and the different ways of one affects the other, subject, object, and so forth. So I'm thinking maybe it's, piety is a kind of a relational, form that that also changes. Like you can't take the becoming out of being, or the being out of becoming. They kind of go together, and it changes with time. And so, what was at one time impious, will be, pious at another time, with new knowledge and new ways of thinking. So, just like you said, at the quantum level, the observer affects what is there, right? And you can't get away from that. We can't get away from our subjectivity and view something purely objective. It's always a relational process, and so maybe that's what the form of the pious is. It's continually changing with with the circumstances.
Great. I really like the words, the way you put that. Piety is a relational form and can't take the being out of becoming and can't take the becoming out of being. It reminds me too of this, again, it reminds me of Timaeus 28a, as I think many things seem to do these days. But it reminds me too of our last discussion on the Critias, and this idea that there is a divine portion in people. So remembering the Critias was that story of Atlantis, and the Atlanteans were this wonderful civilization. They operated in harmony for a long time, and then they started to lose their divine portion. That word, that phrase, divine portion, was used. And maybe that kind of just speaks to what you just said, JK, in terms of can't take the being out of becoming and can't take the becoming out of being. There's always this divine portion, if we think of that as relating to the realm of being, that which always is and never becomes, but that portion stays in us, as long as we let it stay in us. But in the case of the Atlanteans, when we talked about Critias, they lost enough of that divine portion. It was mixed with too much mortality, too much assumptions, too much rigid definition, those rules written down in stone, that they lost that. And they went from a state of order to a state of disorder. And that was why the Atlanteans fell, or so goes the story. So I really like the way you put that. And I really like the way it ties to what we learned about the Atlanteans in our last episode. Kevin, what are your thoughts on that?
Thank you. I'm going to another approach, just post idea. It's like a dog. It's coexist, like a yin and a yang. It's like a cause effect at the same time. For example, in mathematics, we have a Mandelbrot set, and complex numbers is also closely, explaining this such thing. For example, it's I square equal to -1. In high school, we never talk about this. You go into engineer level, you get more and more. All makes sense. It's coexist.
I like that, that word coexisting, existing at the same time, and you use some particularly mathematical concepts. I mean, you started by talking about the yin and the yang, and there's this wonderful diagram of a circle with, half of it being dark and the other half being light, and there's some very interesting mathematics. You mentioned the Mandelbrot set, which is fractal geometry, and certainly Plato is all about geometry, as is quantum computing and the qubit, which with quantum computing will operate. It's fundamentally geometric, but the Mandelbrot set, is an interesting idea of fractal geometry, and if there is this divine portion in us, how does that divine portion fraction into each and every one of us? Each and every one of us contains a fraction or a fractal of that divine portion, and how do we preserve that fractal or that fraction and not lose that? And I think Plato's view would be that dialogue is key to that, and that idea of sharing perspectives, because each of us, again with that idea that Jay mentioned a few episodes ago, was each of us is only seeing a little fraction or a fractal of reality. And how do we take all of those fractions and how do we put them into something that speaks some sort of sense? does it relate to science itself? You know, the nature of science itself is and this again talks about our episode on the Charmides, which was on science. But the Charmides was, asked the question, is there a science of self? We have all of these other sciences. We have the sciences, we have, combinatorics, for example, science that combines mathematics and geometry. Kevin, you mentioned complex numbers, the value I, which is called the imaginary number. It was really, brought together by Gauss and his student Riemann. And Gauss actually liked the term, I understand he preferred the term lateral. So each number is on what's called a real line, which is infinitely dense, but then can expand laterally. I really like that term lateral instead of imaginary, because there's really nothing imaginary about it. We know that it's real in a sense. Like, it has an effect. But the word imaginary is now used, but Gauss used the term lateral. So, how do we take this general idea of number, which is infinitely dense, from the real line in the complex plane, and how do we expand it laterally? I think that's a great, you use the term, Kevin, coexist, and I think that's a great idea, actually, that ties that mathematical concept of the complex plane together. But I think it has a real relevance to this discussion. If we think of the gods as these eternal beings that always are and never become, then maybe that's something that is, that kind of infinitely dense, analogy of the real line in the complex plane. It's never subject to dilution. Each of us gets a part of it, but we can never have the whole of it. And maybe that's why in Timaeus 28a, when they were talking about the realm of being, that which always is and never becomes, the only way you can understand that is through making a reason to count. And the reason to count, I think, is what Socrates was trying to do with Euthyphro between 9b and 11a, is to try to understand what's the subject and the object, what is the cause and what is the effect. Maybe we can have a look here at the last reading, Eva, if you would go to the last page there. Yeah, that would be great. And again, just wondering if these are relatively short sections, if I could have any volunteers to read this particular passage, again, between Socrates and Euthyphro. I could do one of the roles if somebody could do the other.
I'd love to do Euthyphro.
Okay.
Okay, I'll be Socrates.
Excellent. Thank you.
To sacrifice is to make a gift to the gods, whereas to pray is to beg from the gods.
Definitely Socrates.
It would follow from this statement that piety would be a knowledge of how to give to and beg from the gods.
You understand what I said very well, Socrates.
That is because I am so desirous of your wisdom, and I concentrate my mind on it, so that no word of yours may fall to the ground. But tell me, what is this service to the gods? You say it is to beg from them and to give to them.
I do.
And to beg correctly would be to ask from them things that we need.
What else?
And to give correctly is to give them what they need from us. For it would not be skillful to bring gifts to anyone that are in no way needed.
True, Socrates.
Piety would then be a sort of trading skill between gods and men.
Trading, yes, if you prefer to call it that.
I prefer nothing unless it is true. But tell me, what benefit do the gods derive from the gifts they receive from us?
Well, thank you both for that. That's very much appreciated. And I think here we have this idea, again, if we're using the gods as a standard for piety, what is it that the gods would want from us in our expression of piety? And so maybe we can tie this into this idea of cause and effect here. What is the cause of what the gods are looking from us, and what is the effect? Just wondering what people think about this section and this idea of piety as being some sort of a trait. If we're pious, does that get us some sort of special favor that we get if we're not pious? And again, do the gods love us because we're pious, or is it because we are pious that we are loved by the gods? And so, is it this kind of trade that's going on here, or is there something wrong with this idea of the trade? Moshe, what are your thoughts?
I just want to point out that in the Joet translation of this dialogue, affairs of trade is translated, or trade is translated as affairs of business, which makes the terms of this make it very vulgar, and it's important to point out the histrionics of this. I think so, in order to be able to understand what Socrates is getting at.
Mm-hmm. I appreciate that, and it's good to remind constantly that the translation is really, and this is something I learned from one of our earlier episodes, that the idea that translation is according to meaning, and so each translator discerns a different meaning, and so the translation that you just referred to, Moshe, is the idea of meaning, the idea that trading is a business. And I think you used the word vulgar. Is it this kind of purely functional transaction that we have with the gods in our relationship with the gods, that we enter into this functional transaction that we get and we give? Is it that really is that what piety, and is that what life is about in terms of our relation with the gods? Is it a business transaction? Is there equal value being exchanged here? Really the question at the end is, what do the gods get from us? The gods have everything, don't they? They're the eternal beings. What could they possibly get from us that would be of value to them?
And why would they need it?
Yeah. Are we ascribing some sort of human characteristics to the gods? That they're needy beings, that they need something? Would a god actually need something?
It's purely anthropomorphic.
Yeah. Anthropomorphic, interesting idea. We put our own perspectives on the gods, right? And again, maybe that warning that was put in Critias at 107, this warning about speaking of things that we can't possibly know. You have Jane with your hand up. Jane, what are your thoughts on this?
I just wanted to make, I guess, a small note about the gods, because I'm trying to evaluate this based on other dialogues that I've read, and from what Socrates said in multiple different dialogues, I would say that he does not view the gods as being eternal beings, and he seems to be indirectly questioning them all the time. From other dialogues, it would seem that Socrates would relate any existing thing with a physical body to be something that is unable to reach the realm of eternal, the realm of what is, because I don't remember which dialogue this was in, but he specifically mentions that one of the reasons that he does not fear death is because to him death is a kind of way of freeing himself from his body and finally reaching that world of the eternal. So to me, it would seem that Socrates views gods as something that has something mortal to it, and therefore does not understand about these forms in full. And again, that the argument that the gods always quarrel among themselves also sort of suggests this idea that they are not in fact internal beings. And so just like humans, perhaps they are able, again, within the universe of Socrates, these gods are able to see fragments of what is eternal, but just like humans, but only in maybe a wider spectrum. And so we still remain with the problem of them not having access and humans not having access. And from the logic that I'm getting, that Socrates implies, is that a human, when he is alive and living in this world, will never be able to get the full understanding of the eternal idea. And all that you're left with is this sort of wise unknowing of everything, and this openness to realizing how little you know about those eternal ideas that hold some kind of objective truth in them. That's it. Thank you.
Yeah, I think this idea that you mentioned just at the end of knowing what you don't know, for, again, Socrates was famous for, announcing what the oracle said about him through his friend Chaerephon, who relayed what the oracle said about Socrates was that he was the smartest man alive, for he knew one thing, which is that he knew nothing. And maybe that's particularly relevant and important when we come to appreciating this distinction that Timaeus 28a between that which always is and never becomes, and that which becomes but never is. And so I think that's an important point that you raise. And where we go with that, I think is that's you mentioned Socrates kind of welcoming death as an escape, and I think that was from the Phaedo that you were mentioning there, that kind of this realm of the soul is separate from the physical realm that we exist in. The physical realm is the realm that's limited. Certainly in the physics, we know that action is always action is always matched by reaction in equal and opposite measure. But is the soul actually subject to that? Is there any limitation on the soul? Would you want to construct a universe in which there was a limitation on the soul? Would that be a good thing? And maybe this idea of piety, again, to go back to this screen image that I've got on my screen, this painting of Galileo being subjected to the Inquisition, being condemned by the Inquisition to not being able to publish his views, which they assumed was impious. Maybe that's kind of an artificial restriction on the soul, or an assumed restriction on the soul. But is the soul actually something that can be restricted that way? And maybe that's what you were talking about, Jane, in terms of, I think when you mentioned that idea of the Phaedo, where Socrates is about to go to his death, but looks upon it as an escape, maybe an escape from the physical realm and into the less limited or unlimited realm of the soul. Moshe, your thoughts?
Well, on my take on the overall is that the human beings don't really exist, and I don't think piety really exists either. And the reason why I say that is because in the Phaedrus, you have this thing from the Timaeus that you like, and I like that too, but I like this thing from the Phaedrus where the gods are what they are because of their closeness to the forms. And this idea that being which is never becoming and becoming which is never being is a way of saying that the forms never change. They're eternal. They're eternal. They're unchanging, but they are directly knowable. Okay, and they are knowable by the soul, and we know from Plato's account of how human beings, how a soul gets into a human being as opposed to an ant. is because of its proximities to the forms, and the closer as they crawl and they scratch against each other to get that amount of knowledge that means that they will become a human being. And then that is further differentiated into, depending upon the closest that you have to the forms, the soul has to the forms, whether you become a sophist or a warrior or a philosopher or anything like that. Why do I say that piety doesn't exist? Because if we're saying that the soul is the thing that exists and that the soul gets into the human being becomes and dies, but the soul doesn't, because the soul goes back and scratches again to come into some other physical reality, some sort of physical existence. I don't want to use the word reality because I want to equate that to what Plato took reality to be, which was the forms. But to come into physical existence, which will eventually, it will cease, because that's what happens when you become. And then, as I said, the soul will go back. But why is there no piety? There is no piety because the soul only gets knowledge by its proximity to the forms, and the gods become gods by their proximity to the forms. And it's not the gods that need piety. It's certainly not the forms that need piety. Piety may be a form, but it's not something that human beings, transactionally or any other way, can get a grasp on.
Thank you. You put that very powerfully. I think the idea that the gods are what they are because of their proximity to the forms, and that the forms are knowable by the soul. I think if I paraphrased you correctly there, and I write down these ideas, and that's one that particularly struck me. This idea that the forms are knowable by the soul, and so you talked about Phaedrus, which was, it's just that whole idea of understanding the general form that was so front and center in the themes that we discussed in the Phaedrus. Understanding, getting this proximity to the general form. We're all the time we're subjected to the particulars of existence. So the particulars of piety, or the particulars of virtue, the particulars of this or the particulars of that. There's so many particulars in the course of our lives. The particulars maybe we just think of as examples, kind of what Meno did in the Meno, where he gave examples of virtue, and what Euthyphro is doing in this dialogue by giving examples of piety, but never being able to trace it back or to root it, to use a bit of a mathematical expression, maybe to be able to root it in a general form. And the general form maybe being kind of analogous to the again, what I mentioned earlier, what Kevin made me think of, this idea of the real line in the complex plane. The real line is being infinitely dense and never dissolves, never loses its capacity. It always retains infinite capacity. And so, this idea that the forms are knowable by the soul, I think, is a very important one, as you put it. And how do we attain that knowledge? How do we attain that knowledge of the forms? I think it was clear in the Phaedrus that communication is essential, so that we work with the same, that we compare our ideas, and we find the idea of relativity, or the relational aspects of these ideas. I think that was what, can't remember who said it earlier. Was it JK maybe that said piety is a relational form? How do we relate these forms if by any other means than by discussion and dialogue, like what we're doing here? Is there any other means that we could find these general forms that we're looking for? Maybe to put the question that way, can anybody think of any other means by which, each of us having had a glimpse of truth and beauty and virtue and all of these things, but none of us having a full grasp on it, how can we find these general forms? Is it a question of trading with the gods, or this business transaction with the gods, to say I'm pious either because you love me or because I love you, and somehow we get that greater grasp of this eternal idea, or is it by some other means? Again, I just keep thinking about the account of the reasons why. At the end of Meno, where again, having said that knowledge is recollection, Socrates then further says that recollection is the account of the reasons why. And how do we make that account? And how do we ensure that the account is complete before we go and start to act on what we think is our knowledge? And how do we delineate or distinguish between what we know and what we don't know? Again, to go into this image I have on my screen, at the time, Galileo could see that things weren't as they had been assumed, and that things didn't all orbit the Earth. He saw that there were moons orbiting Jupiter, and so that really turned what was perceived to be knowledge on its head, and he was called impious for it. So how do we delineate? How do we create that definition between what is knowledge and what is not knowledge, and how do we ensure that the account of the reasons why is complete before we go and we accuse people of impiety and cause all sorts of things like the death of Socrates, like the prosecution by Euthyphro of his father? How do we ensure that these actions are just, which really gets us into thinking about the idea of justice and that great dialogue, the Republic, which I'd love to do in season 2 of our podcast. JK, your thoughts?
Yeah, it seems like the knowledge and these forms that are accumulative across time, and that the forms are not static, that they are something like Carl Jung's idea of the archetypes. Of the unconscious. They accumulate knowledge, and they change, and they're added on, with the more we progressively learn about ourselves and the world. So I think that would kind of account for why someone like Galileo was was condemned for his scientific knowledge of what is the truth. So I think maybe that's what Socrates was trying to get at. But I think maybe perhaps Plato have a different view, that he wanted to elevate knowledge to the status of mathematics, and mathematical truth does not change. And maybe there's a kind of a tension there between Socrates and Plato. As Plato was writing these Socratic dialogues, he eventually developed his own idea of what truth is. And I wonder if how much that diverged from what Socrates was doing as a kind of a pursuit of truth by rhetoric and by dialogue. So.
Well, thank you. And I what you just said about truth and mathematics caused me to change my screen image here to the torus, which is an interesting object. And I put it in the notes for this session because the torus is comprised of 2 circles, and a circle consists of a ratio that's incomplete. It's incommensurable, and that's pi, the circumference over the diameter of the circle, and that ratio goes on forever. So it's not necessarily complete. And so you ask the question: is knowledge like mathematics something that is complete? And I'm wondering if we have things like these incommensurable aspect that affects mathematics and geometry, like pi, as something that is not necessarily complete, but is completely fundamental to the operation of mathematics. So you asked a very good question. I think that's a question that I'd like to hear from the rest of the participants. Is knowledge definite and unchanging, and is that something that Plato thought knowledge was, or not? And is there some sort of tension here in that? I like the way you said too that the forms are not static; they accumulate over time. And you use the word archetypes. Archetype is kind of this idea of model, something that can be built upon, but is not static. And I thought that was a very good use of words, and I think really gives cause to reflect on the nature of the forms themselves. We talked in our last episode on the Critias about the nature of time, and whether time is linear, which I think is, a pretty wide assumption now. When we go through our daily lives, we're not thinking of time as being other than something that runs from the past to the future in a straight line. Right? I think that's kind of just maybe a built-in assumption that we operate with, and maybe that's something that our senses bring to us. But I think we made the point when we were discussing the Critias that time could maybe be circular. Time goes in circles, and I think that's maybe what in Timaeus, when Plato first started talking about Atlantis, he started talking about Atlantis at the beginning of the Timaeus, and then he continued the discussion in the Critias. But at the beginning of the Timaeus, he talked about these cycles of creation and destruction over time. And he talked about great fires and great floods that have destroyed ancient civilizations. And we know, as I mentioned, I think the last episode, we know that there was, for example, an asteroid that hit off the coast of Mexico about, I think it was 200 million years ago, that caused such a firestorm from the release of energy on its impact that it wiped out almost all of the existence across the planet. We know that these cycles of destruction happen periodically and that memory is lost. We have to recreate memory over time. And there was that great, sequence where Solon goes to visit the Egyptian priests and was told about this ancient civilization Atlantis that had been forgotten, some 9,600 years maybe before Plato's time or before Socrates' time. So I like this idea of, this accumulation over time, and that time may not be a linear thing. It may be something that is circular. And a circle has no beginning and no end. And I think that's a key to understanding maybe the connection between geometry and Plato's philosophy, which was, I think, based on geometry. He was a geometer. Moshe, you have your hand up. What are your thoughts on this?
There we go. Okay. I always find this particular podcast that you do to be very stimulating. So thanks for the work. I want to point out that I want to point out when you're talking about the relational nature of time, I don't want to get too hung up on that. Let me just point out, you keep saying that time goes forward, okay? Well, our clocks would work just as accurately if they went backward. And the formulas of physics work perfectly, whether their time is going forward or backward. I mean, we're simply accustomed to seeing it go from 1 to 12, but it could as functionally go from 12 to 1. Okay, and that doesn't lead to any sort of strange physics. It might lead to strange experience. We might be in sort of a Merlin sort of situation where we're grown. We start out old and we grow young, and we keep trying to figure this out. But I want to point out that even if time is linear, it doesn't have to go forward. It can go backward. The second thing is about pi, and pi. If we acknowledge that there is something that there are actual infinite collections, then at the standpoint at the from the perspective of the forms, what Spinoza used to talk about from the perspective of eternity, pi would be an actual infinite collection. It wouldn't. It would be infinite, but it wouldn't be something that you could always add one more to. It would completely be there. If you're looking, it's possible it could completely be there if you're looking at it from the standpoint of eternity. So I want to make those two observations. The third observation that I want to make is that Socrates is not removed completely from the pre-Socratic materialists. Okay, that the materialists, going back, from Thales to Anaximander and the development of materialism into atomism, and then you had the Pythagorean turn toward mathematics, and we get the idea of the eternal. But in Anaxagoras, we have the idea of mind in nature as comes out. The argument is that mind can be seen in nature in the form of reason. Okay, and why do we say that? Because in nature we can see an order. Okay, it is a cosmos. It's an ordered thing. And how do we see order in humanity? Well, we see order in humanity, or we see reason in humanity in politics, because in politics you see men, women organizing themselves using reason. So it follows from reason, reason, the logi, being understood by nous, is manifest in human existence in politics. And politics, if we take a look at some of the other thinkers like Aristotle, is something that is done by individual men. So we conclude from that individuals have reason and have the capacity to reason. So that is why, as human beings, we want to exploit that reason and use that to understand what reality is. Those are just my observations.
Well, thank you very much.
The Platonic turn, by the way, is that Plato had broken away. He's even further detached from the materialists than Socrates is, and he is now describing what reality is, because reality to him has to be something eternal, beautiful, permanent, infinite, non-changing. Okay, and that's what he's giving us and what we're trying to struggle with. But it comes from a material basis.
Well, thank you, and I appreciate the support on the stimulation that you're finding from these sessions, and I get as much stimulation from the participants, I think, as I hope I provide. But I learn something new every time, and I think what you just said is an example of that. This idea that both time and physics work forward as well as backward. I think that's a key idea, a key connection that we can make, and it goes back to, again, this idea of making connections, which is something that I think Greg mentioned in the last episode about kind of this harmony of knowledge and our making connections, and JK spoke in the last episode about the forms being a model or a lattice for society. And I think where this is all leading to, as you mentioned, is this idea of politics and how we apply reason in our relations to each other. And I think that's where I'd like to go very much in season 2 of this podcast, is the that great work, the Republic. And some have held that Plato was tyrannical and wanted to set up this kind of almost soulless society. society governed by rules, not necessarily by reason. And I'd like to very much explore that. Personally, I'd like to challenge that, but I think we should at least explore that. And I think these dialogues that we're having are going to be very good at equipping us to explore that in season 2 of this podcast. Certainly there's great logic, I think, in the idea that time and physics work both ways, both forward and backwards. As you mentioned, Moshe, I think that's pretty key. Logic, if something's logical, it has to be logical in all instances. At least that's the way I see logic. It can't be logic in one direction and not in the other. So I found that was a very powerful expression. And then this idea that we have to retain the capacity of reason. And then you mentioned Anaxagoras, which I think I mentioned at the beginning too. So I just, again, a shout out here for Peter Adamson's podcast, History of Philosophy Without Any Gaps. And that was I've had some time to spend just reviewing the earlier episodes of that. One of his first few episodes was on Anaxagoras. And this idea that mind is separate from matter. Maybe an idea too that Descartes brought out much later, but this idea that maintaining this separation allows mind to observe matter. So a question of what is the observer and what is the observed, and then we get back into this idea of subject and object again that we've been talking about earlier in this episode. So we've got
one qualification, if I can.
Yeah.
The Cartesian doubt, 1500 or so years later, is separate. The Greeks did not have that particular point of view. To the Greeks, the human being was as much a part of nature, and mind was as mind was. Mind was a part of nature, and the human being was a part of nature. And we didn't get to this radical separation of mind and body, or soul and nature, until hundreds of years later. And there's a big question of whether or not Descartes was right. I mean, he certainly overreached in a lot of places, but whether that's radical skepticism is even supportable, that's really an open question, at least to me.
Absolutely, and I think that's a good point to make. I was thinking more about this kind of dualism of mind and matter. The initial basis, I think, of Descartes' thought, but that also tied, I think, somewhat to Anaxagoras. So definitely a good point. So we've got about 15 minutes left in our recording. And so I see Greg and JK with your hands up, so we'll take Greg.
So I just like to kind of continue what Marsha was pointing out about the materialistic kind of a tradition of what Socrates and Plato was on this reasoning. I think the very word itself, reason, came from logos. Logos was originally not really meant for reason, but just a word order. So I think that, but what I want to say is that here they choose the subject of piety and in connection with God. And if it's not God, then what can we be a standard? So it didn't say specifically, but I think it implies that at the end of the day, it's our reason. At the time, it might not be very clear, the reason, but the elements are there because they want to undo this facade. I mean, the bigger standard of the gods for everything. But if you undo it, what can we base? So I think it allude to the reason, and the reason, the reasonability. The method of reasoning was going to take another 100 years. I mean, like another 50 years also until Aristotle completed. But Plato and Socrates started the journey, pointed to the definition and the category and a number of other things, and towards the this complete logical reasoning to allow the people to really get what is knowledge, and then to really to be able to seek truth. Because otherwise, truth is just a name. How you gonna get it? How do you know truth? What is truth? And what's the relation between knowledge and truth? And that's all kind of you see the elements already starting this dialogue.
Definitely, I like the way that you called this a journey, and certainly I think we're on a very interesting journey here. And the journey is something that I think is best experienced together rather than alone. I think together there's a ability to create a lot more reason than there is individually. I think as we find, certainly with Euthyphro initially making assumptions and then changing his mind because the assumptions are challenged, which wouldn't have happened if he had not been challenged. And so I think it's maybe Socrates' role in these dramas that Plato is bringing to us to challenge and to kind of extend our journey into paths that we hadn't seen at the beginning, because we're not able to see all of those paths individually. We're only able to see certain things. So I think that journey is broadened for all of us. And certainly you mentioned the word logos and the question of the order of in which knowledge occurs. And I think that's fundamental to the account of the reasons why. And again, to this question that is brought up in Euthyphro 10d to 11a, this idea of what is the cause and what is the effect, what is the subject and what is the object. And if the pious person is both the subject and the object, in 11a, I think Socrates really kind of says that it's a bit of a feedback loop, which, to tie it into the realm of quantum computing, a feedback loop is not something that you want to create in quantum computing. As we get this fantastic technology, we need to understand the difference between subject and object. So I really like the way you put some of those ideas. JK, over to you.
Yeah, I wanted to, talk about this idea of time. You said that time is circular, and or it's a straight line. So it seems like there are two images of time, and I think the Stoics had these two images of time, the chronos and the ion. And so there's Nietzsche's eternal return. That's another image of time that it sounds like circular. I'm not sure if it's a straight line or a circular, but if it's a return, but it's a return of not the same, but the difference, then of course, and so that could be, it could be neither circular or a straight line. But yeah, so if you look at it mathematically, would time be circular then, in terms of how Plato sees it?
It's a good question, and I'm wondering what others think. I mean, it's earlier Kevin mentioned yin and yang, which has a particular geometric representation contained within a circle. Can you have differences within a circle, but not at the circumference of the circle? The circumference of the circle is continuous, right? So you've got a continuum at the circumference, but inside maybe you can have lots of differences, lots of peaks and valleys inside the circle. And certainly I think in three-dimensional geometry and in mathematical combinatorics, which involves the complex plane and combining mathematics and geometry, I think we see many examples of those peaks and valleys. But at the end of the day, pi is pi, right? So pi goes on forever, and is the 2 pi is the circumference of a circle. So maybe pi is kind of that analogy of something that is infinite, not defined, continuous, but can contain difference I mean, you used the word difference, which I thought was an interesting point, and I don't know if others have any thoughts on that, and whether Plato had any specific views on that. Jane, your ideas?
James, I'm not going to be able to comment on your mathematical perception of view of this, because I just don't have the background for that. But to the general question of time and how we perceive it, at least based on the way that I perceive time, it's not exactly linear. It's always, and I guess things, oh, sorry about that, things that we attribute to time, like the change of seasons, like the way that the day comes and goes, it's all circular. So we're seeing circular motion of time in a lot of aspects that we attribute to time. But despite being that circular motion, there's also this sense of progression that happens to the circular motion itself. I hope that's making sense. And so in a way, if we look at it as a picture, it could look like, it could resemble a spiral, because you're having these circular motions that are also moving, progressing throughout time. And by moving or progressing, it could be positive development change, or it could be negative development or change. That's it. That's all I want to say. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Jane. And you certainly gave, I think, a powerful analogy with the word spiral, and if you think of, maybe the circle, the circumference doesn't change. And, a circle is defined as that which has no beginning and no ending. But if you increase or decrease the scope of the circle, make it increase the radius or decrease the radius of the circle, and then you start to get multiple circles working together, then you start to maybe think in your mind, well, okay, maybe there's a spiral, and maybe these circles are starting to go in one direction or another. And maybe that's kind of what we do with our reasons, is the reasons that we apply, and the causes and effects that we ascribe to things like piety in this dialogue, or any of the other topics that Plato has talked about. Maybe that kind of creates a direction that spirals, or creates a course of logic that spirals in one direction or the other. And so maybe that's that kind of capacity of reason that we retain in ourselves, is that ability to create those spirals, to increase or decrease the scope of the circles. If time works in a circular fashion, or at least if time has no beginning and no end, which I think is what our experience kind of tells us. It just, the past becomes the present, becomes the future, becomes the past, becomes the present, becomes the future. It's this continuous cycle. How do we get differences in that cycle, and yet time continues? So I think it's a fascinating subject, and fascinating to think of time that way, as something that's not just a straight line, something other than a straight line, and maybe a circle, and something that we can certainly explore either with some specific mathematics and geometry, or with analogy, because I think analogy is a perfectly valid way to go for those who don't have specific mathematical or geometric knowledge, but certainly all of us experience the effects of mathematics and geometry in our everyday lives, and so we can make analogies, I think, that are perfectly acceptable. And I think Plato would be perfectly happy for analogies to be made in the course of dialogue. So I think it's been a great discussion. I wanted to thank everybody. I mean, boy, I've got a whole page full of notes from today's session that have really caused me to think in some of the particular words that have been used, and in the connections that have been made. And I think, again, the idea of knowledge as this kind of harmony of connections, which we talked about last time, is really coming to the forefront here. And very much looking forward to our next discussion on the Theaetetus, which I think will take it to another level. So wanted to thank everybody for participating, and just remind everybody that we'll keep the session open after the recording ends for Plato's Cafe, just for a casual discussion for those who would like to stick around and talk about the Euthyphro or any of the other dialogues that we've looked at, or just philosophy in general. I think that would be great to connect that way. And in the meantime, I will pass it over to Eva to end the official recording part of the session. Eva?
Thank you, Joe, for joining us, friends. Thank you, James, for preparing all this discussion and managing the open discussion. Please stay for Plato's Cafe now, which will not be recorded. Why? Because sometimes we enjoy unrecorded discussions with friends. Until next time, friends. Bye.